Hello and welcome to Voices of BlueScope, the podcast where we meet the people who work behind the scenes at BlueScope to create strength every day. I'm your host, Martin Feld. Thank you for listening. BlueScope acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land on which we work, live and operate. We recognise our First Nations peoples who have inhabited Australia for millennia, their enduring connection to country, sky and waterways, and their rich and vital cultures. We acknowledge the many different nations across this ancient continent, from rural and remote communities to our cities and suburban streets. We honour and pay respect to ancestors, elders, and their descendants as the custodians of this country. It is through the ancestral knowledges and stories of local peoples that we can more fully know and understand country and the unique ways in which country connects us all. Today we are revisiting a guest who featured in episode 12 of the podcast. That person is Letitia Holmes, who worked with BlueScope as an intern with CareerTrackers, an Australian non-profit organisation that supports Indigenous young adults to attend and graduate from university. Since that first conversation and the completion of her internship, Letitia has joined BlueScope as a full-time laboratory technician. We took the opportunity to interview her again, asking her to expand on her professional journey and share insights into her Indigenous identity and heritage. Let's cross to the interview now, which we recorded at the Innovation Labs in Port Kembla, Australia. Thank you so much for joining Voices of BlueScope again, Letitia. It's great to see you.
Thank you, Martin.
Now, the last time that we spoke, you were an intern based here at BlueScope, but working through CareerTrackers, which is an Indigenous internship program. Can you tell us about that experience of going from being an intern with CareerTrackers at BlueScope to joining the company as an employee?
Yes, well, when I first came to BlueScope, I actually started in this particular area, which is the iLabs building, where we do research and development for the company. Initially, I came here for my first internship. Then I went to the MCL, which is the metal coating line, and did some work on my second internship there, and now I'm back where I started from. So the project I'm working on at the moment has been drawing on a lot of my experiences from those internships, both of those internships. So I've been able to pull that information together, and it's fed directly into the work that I'm doing now.
Fantastic, and well done on kicking off that new role here. What is your title here at BlueScope now? What sort of department are you working within?
I'm a laboratory technician, and I'm working in developing a special product that will be released onto the worldwide market.
Now, I'd like to, with that context, now go back even further and get an insight into maybe your personal and professional story leading up to this point. Can you share a bit more about yourself and where your interest in this career and this discipline started? Take us to the beginning.
Oh, that's a long way back. Well, I'm a Durrumbul woman from the area near Yeppoon in Queensland. I did not grow up on country, and I have had a bit of a dissection in my historical background in terms of learning about my background. I've come back to that as a result of a few family situations that have happened. My mother was in a large family of 8 children, and there were a lot of things that she wanted to take to the grave with her, and as it turned out, she was the last of her 7 siblings to pass away, and in the very last years of her life, she started to divulge a lot of information that she really didn't want to talk about in previous years. So I think, in a way, if she wasn't the last person to pass away within her siblings group, that she probably wouldn't have divulged any of the stories, and they came out a bit at a time, so it took a bit of piecing together. There were a few stories, one of which was that she didn't really have much education. She was not allowed to go to school, and it was not talked about why she wasn't allowed to go to school, and this went on for quite some years. So eventually it came out that her father was rounded up and sent off to a leper colony in Queensland called Peel Island, and that's where they sent a lot of people that were either Aboriginal or had an association with an Aboriginal person. He was married to one. So he was sent off to the leper colony, and his children were isolated, something like what lockdown is now, but they were isolated for years and weren't allowed to go to school, which meant that she wasn't able to get a formal education. That was one of the factors that really wanted me to push towards getting a formal education, a tertiary education, and she's my inspiration for that.
Thank you for sharing that. What were you undertaking at university?
I was in an engineering degree in medical and radiation physics. One of the things that is interesting about that particular field is there doesn't seem to be a natural crossover to anything that we're doing here at BlueScope. However, there are a couple of doctors here that is their field of study, and they were able to place me into engineering roles where I'm utilising a lot of the skills that cross over. It's not a natural choice. Most people go into mechanical engineering or chemical engineering, materials engineering. Those are probably the main three engineering departments that would be utilised here at the Innovation Labs. So I was a bit of a fish out of water, but I still had the ability to cross over into those fields.
And your specific field, can you give some more specific information about what you learnt or what was entailed in your degree? People who might be thinking, oh, okay, well, I'm undertaking this, or I might be interested in undertaking that, and entering a field where they are a bit of a fish out of water, like you said.
There were a lot of things that didn't come naturally to me. My father had an engineering background. He was an aircraft engineer during the war, and an electrical engineer. So I grew up with that type of background, but a lot of things didn't necessarily come naturally to me, maybe in terms of the mathematics side rather than the science side. I think that if it's something that you have an interest in, try and pursue it, because along the way you'll get a lot of support. Through the university I got support through a program called ITAP, ITAP, which is a tuition program. With whatever subject you're doing, they find you a tutor that will help you along with the coursework and give you more of a one-on-one. That was a big assistance to me in the subjects that I was maybe not so strong in.
And this was at the University of Wollongong, here locally?
That's right, but every university in Australia has an Indigenous centre that will provide support in that way.
And when it comes to your Indigenous background and heritage and the culture that you practice, how do you feel that guides you or helps in your day-to-day working life? Because I remember the last time that we spoke, you were talking about how certain stories from the dreaming essentially empowered you to think differently.
Yes, that's right, because I think Indigenous people have a way of thinking about things that is not necessarily a straightforward way from A to B. And I think the benefit of that is that when it comes to problem solving, you have an extra set of eyes that are looking at the problem from a different lens. And although it might not be your initial thought process to think along these lines, I think being open to looking at different ideas, different solutions, different approaches to things, it's a bit like brainstorming or doing a mud map. You've got to accept all the ideas as a start, and then from there it can snowball and you can start to develop frameworks for your solutions.
And you also explained that you come from Queensland. Now, naturally, there are many different First Nations around Australia, lots of different histories and cultures and stories. Since coming to the Illawarra and pursuing your career here, are there things that you've learned locally in the area about different ways of life and different First Nations cultures that are different from where you came in Queensland?
Yes, that's right. There, in particular for me, the one that has the most effect almost daily is the weather pattern, because where I come from, it's more of a subtropical area, whereas here there's a completely different weather pattern. And so we live here in Dharawal country. They have 6 different seasons during the year, and a lot of them you can start to notice by constellations in the sky changing, and looking into nature at different flowers that blossom, or the way animals behave and things like that. Yes, you're right in saying that there are different cultural identifications in nature, in the sky, and also with language too. I'm trying to learn a couple of the local Indigenous languages, Dharawal language and Wiradjuri language, which is a bit more west of here.
And where you originate in Queensland, can you tell us a bit about the language and cultural group where you come from?
Yes, that's right. I didn't grow up on country. My family were displaced and moved out of the area, shifted out of the area. The area where my heritage comes from is Darumbal, which is the Yeppoon area of Queensland. It's about in central Queensland.
And what are some of the, I suppose, the main or most influential stories from that area, or things that are important to you?
There was a big massacre that happened there. I think it's really important to remember that things can happen quickly with people's thought processes, and we should always be aware that none of these things ever repeat. And that's not only with First Nations people, but all cultures. We should be highly aware that small thought processes can snowball and become a big thought process to a group of people. So we should be aware that we don't take on those ideas, and remember that we need to be a group, a mob together.
That's a great piece of guidance or advice generally, to learn from the mistakes of the past. And thinking about advice, for any people who may have a First Nations background, identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, and are thinking about undertaking a discipline or entering engineering as you have, what would be the general advice that you'd give to people who are thinking about taking that first step?
I think that what happens with a lot of Indigenous people is they don't necessarily finish high school, and this is where they may think, oh, that's it for me, I don't have that opportunity anymore. But there are alternate pathways that people can take into university and TAFE. For example, if someone's only gone to grade 10, or maybe they haven't gone to grade 10, they've gone to grade 9, even younger than that, they should remember that there is a way to get around it. It's not necessarily the A to B pathway that a lot of people would take when they graduate high school, but there are bridging programs that can enable you to do that. And the main thing is just to start researching what it is they can do, and don't be scared to ask questions and say to people, well, how did you get into uni, or how did you get into that field? And just start asking people how they did it, and then you'll start to see that it's never really as straightforward as people think.
Yeah, it's not always a direct path, you're absolutely right. And I recall when we were just chatting briefly before we sat down for this interview, you mentioned that you used to work in photography, that's right?
Yes, that's right.
So that's quite a big shift, a previous job in photography elsewhere. What do you think are some of the things that you've brought from your diverse career path into BlueScope, different ways of thinking, and on top of that, what are some of the things that you think you've learnt in working here?
Yes, that's a really big factor that was one of the deciding factors when I came into BlueScope, even as an intern. The fact that I had a background in photography was straight down the path of what they were looking at for artificial intelligence and digital imaging, and that type of imaging pathway, data analysis through imaging. So even though people have they might have a completely different background from what they did before university. There's always a way that you can incorporate skills, maybe not necessarily technical skills, but life skills into the job that you're doing. Often employers will look for those intrinsic skills in other areas. You may not even know further down the track that, this might be useful or that might be useful, but it's funny how when you can look at it in retrospect and say, oh, well, that was a deciding factor. The fact that I had a background in photography and imaging was a deciding factor in me getting an internship with this company.
That's really interesting that photography led you through to digital imaging. And when you talk about digital imaging, I understand maybe you can't share all the specifics of projects that you're doing, but can you tell us about some of the different equipment or maybe digital imaging ideas or tools that you have to interact with?
Yes, there's a lot of imaging equipment within the company that requires computer programs that I didn't know anything about prior, because the computer programs are specific to the equipment used in the process that they're looking at. So that was a bit of a big learning curve, especially in predictive modelling. It's something that I didn't cover at university and wasn't a part of my course, but it's something that you can learn on the job, and people shouldn't discount that too, things that you can learn on the job. Personally, for me, I find it much easier to learn it in a practical situation than at university, and I would prefer to learn a lot of those things on the job. I think that was probably the main one.
So theory and practice going hand in hand.
Yes, yes.
Now, is there anything that I haven't asked you about in your personal story or career background that you'd like to mention in this interview? Something that's gone untapped?
I think people have a tendency to doubt themselves in situations. I think it's something that we should look at ourselves and think, well, not why me, but why not me? Why can't I do that? Not, well, why should I do that? Why can't I do that? Of course I can do it. And then just keep that determination up, and as long as you have motivation and potential for doing a role, just pursue it, persist with it, and it's not all going to flow nicely, but it's something that if you're persistent, that you'll get there eventually. Keep your eyes open. Keep your eyes and ears open.
I think that's fantastic advice to end on. So thank you so much for joining us, Letitia. It was great to chat again.
Yeah, thank you, Martin.
That brings this episode to a close. We thank Letitia for her time and for sharing her personal story on the podcast. Make sure to visit the links and show notes in your browser or podcast app for further content, including a TV BlueScope video on YouTube. It features excerpts of the interview that you've just heard, along with relevant footage of BlueScope sites and processes and thoughts from Letitia's manager, Detlev Müller. For other news and updates, go to bluescope.com, visit BlueScope on LinkedIn, or follow @BlueScope on Twitter. Thank you for listening to the Voices of BlueScope podcast. We hope that you'll join us again soon.